A field at the south edge of Rockford, Illinois, is already part of the electric grid's future. There are no server halls operating here. There is no 600 megawatts electric load, but the request in the official planning record is specific: 200 megawatts in June 2028. 451 years later, then an ultimate load of 600 megawatts in 2029. Those numbers matter long before the first rack is energized. A utility studies lines, substations, breakers, and transformers around the load it has been asked to serve. Other projects enter the same queue. Equipment can be designed and ordered. Available capacity on the existing network gets spoken for on paper. That creates an uncomfortable possibility. What happens if the grid prepares for the data center and the data center arrives late, grows more slowly, or never opens? Illinois has an answer. Make the developer sign a contract that protects transmission revenue. The Rockford developer, Monarch Rock Air, signed one with Commonwealth Edison. Under the agreement, the customer owes transmission contributions tied to its promised ramp, even if the project is delayed or canceled. Otherwise, it faces a termination charge. That sounds like the problem is solved. The private project creates the need, and the private customer carries the risk. But the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission accepted this agreement with an important warning. The contract can run for 8 to 10 years. Transmission assets can remain in customer rates for roughly 40. FERC did not independently decide that every term eliminated every cost shift. So what does this contract actually protect? And if the data center does not arrive, who pays for the grid that was prepared around it? Vada then, to understand the contract, start with the physical request. 600 megawatts is not a normal commercial connection. In ComEd's tariff record, a large demand project is one expected to reach at least 50 megawatts within 10 years. ComEd told Illinois regulators that projects below that threshold can often be served by ordinary 12 or 34.5 kilovolt distribution circuits. Loads at or above 50 megawatts commonly push the work into the 138 kilovolt system. That changes the equipment. A neighborhood feeder can branch from an existing substation. A 600 megawatt campus may require new high voltage positions, multiple transformers, protection changes, and network upgrades that have to work during the loss of another line or transformer. The utility is not only asking whether the wires can carry the load on an ordinary day. Engineers study faults, peak conditions, and the failure of a major component. The study begins with a one-line diagram and a location. Engineers place the proposed load on a model of the existing network. They run the system with every major line available, then remove one component at a time. If a remaining line overloads, voltage falls outside its limits, or a breaker would interrupt more current than it is rated to clear, the model identifies a need. That need can become several different projects. A transformer may be added at the customer substation. A conductor may be replaced with one that carries more current. Protection relays may need new settings. The network may need a second path so that the campus does not disappear when one line is out of service. Each response has a different cost and construction schedule. The model also has to include the ramp. A system that can serve 200 megawatts in 2028 may not be ready for 600 1 year later. Some work can be phased, other equipment has to be sized for the ultimate load from the beginning. A large transformer cannot be expanded by changing a software setting. A right-of-way and switchyard must leave room for the final arrangement. This is why a promised ramp has physical consequences before it has a monthly bill. A number in an application can determine the size of steel, copper, and land that enters the plan. The Rockford request did not appear alone. The Illinois Commerce Commission's final order said 75 large demand projects were then in ComEd's connection pipeline. 50 were expected to take service at 138 kilovolts or above. Those are requests, not finished buildings. Some will change, some will move, some may disappear. Yet each serious request consumes real work. The utility has to decide whether the proposed ramp is plausible, what system model to use, which projects should be studied together, and which equipment would become necessary when several loads arrive in the same area. That is why the first protection is not the transmission contract, it is a deposit. ComEd's Enhanced Engineering Deposit covers preliminary planning and the cluster study. The amount scales with the requested load. If the project proceeds, the deposit can be returned or applied to later obligations. If it is abandoned, ComEd keeps the amount needed to cover work already done. That protects the cost of studying a proposal. It does not fund a completed substation. It does not guarantee decades of transmission revenue. It answers a smaller question: who pays the engineers for investigating this request? The second protection applies when ComEd extends its distribution system or orders long lead equipment. Those deposits are tied to facilities and expected revenue. If the customer's actual load falls short, ComEd can retain part of the deposit. Again, useful, but narrower than the whole transmission problem. The grid is shared. A new 138 kilovolt line may be triggered by one campus, then carry power that supports many customers and future connections. A transformer placed for a new load becomes part of the network. That makes a simple private invoice difficult. The equipment may be physically near one project, while its costs and benefits spread through a much larger system. The state therefore approved a third protection. This one does not ask the developer to buy a named transformer. It asks the developer to keep contributing revenue as if its promised load had shown up. The transmission security agreement begins with a line on a chart. For Rockford, that line rises from 200 megawatts to 450 and then 600. ComEd uses the same ramp in its planning studies. The TSA turns it into a financial floor. Under the approved definition, a large demand customer guarantees an annual contribution to ComEd's transmission revenue requirement associated with the submitted ramp for 10 years after service begins. If the data center consumes as much as planned, its ordinary transmission payments can satisfy the obligation. If its contribution comes in below the promised level, the agreement requires it to cover the difference. The logic is easier to see with a smaller example. Imagine a campus tells the utility it will reach 100 megawatts. The grid is studied around that number. The customer later operates at only 40. Without a guarantee, the expected transmission revenue from the missing 60 megawatts also disappears. The fixed system revenue requirement does not disappear with it. Other customers can then carry a larger share. The TSA tells the applicant, the utility prepared around your 100 megawatt statement, so your transmission contribution cannot immediately collapse to the payment associated with 40. For Monarch, the agreement goes further than a vague promise to negotiate later. Commissioner Judy Chang's FERC concurrence describes an obligation that increases with a ramp schedule. The customer pays even if the facility is delayed or canceled. Otherwise, the agreement imposes a termination fee. That is real risk transfer. A developer cannot reserve a large place in the queue at no cost, wait for the utility to prepare, then walk away as though nothing happened. ComEd argued that the agreement also protects other large customers. A proposed load uses up network capability in the planning model. A later applicant may have to wait for upgrades or face a more expensive connection. If the first request was speculative, it did not merely waste an engineer's time. It changed the path offered to the projects behind it. The revenue guarantee creates a reason to submit a realistic ramp early. Overstating the load can increase the customer's later obligation. Behind-the-meter generation, storage, or planned curtailment has to be considered before the utility designs the system, not after oversized equipment is already in the rate base. This is the strongest case for the TSA. It prices a promise, while that promise can still change the physical design. It also explains why calling the agreement a construction bill would be wrong. ComEd does not calculate a list that says this breaker belongs to Monarch, this tower belongs to Monarch, and this conductor belongs to Monarch. The agreement guarantees revenue under the existing transmission rate structure. Shared transmission costs continue to be recovered through the PJM and ComEd system according to the applicable tariffs. The customer promises to contribute as though its ramp were real. That can prevent a shortfall. But a revenue floor and an asset invoice are not the same thing. The difference becomes clearer if the project stops at 4 different moments. If it withdraws during the first study, the engineering deposit pays for the work already performed. No major facilities should have been committed yet. The public exposure is mostly staff time, and the deposit is designed around that cost. If it withdraws after equipment has been ordered, the facility's deposit matters. Long lead transformers and breakers cannot always be returned or reassigned at full value. The utility needs security that follows the purchase order, not only the hours an engineer already billed. If the campus opens but stalls below its ramp, the transmission agreement becomes the main protection. The line and substation may be operating, yet the customer's ordinary transmission contribution is smaller than the system expected. The TSA makes up part of that missing revenue for the covered period. If the campus reaches full load and closes after the guarantee ends, the problem changes again. The agreement may have performed exactly as written, the utility still owns the network. Whether other customers inherit an unused asset depends on later demand, the remaining book value, and the rules for removing costs from rates. These stages show why one large security number cannot protect every risk. Money has to be attached to the moment when the utility becomes committed. An engineering deposit paid after construction would arrive too late. A 10-year revenue guarantee cannot by itself describe a 40-year asset after year 10. The public report should therefore show more than the total collateral. It should identify the project's study stage, the equipment already committed, the amount of forecast load protected by the TSA, and the date each obligation expires. When a request is reduced, the same report should show which planned upgrades were canceled and which remained necessary for the shared network. That turns a promise of protection into a record that can be checked against later rates. They also show why the developer should not be charged twice for the same exposure. If a facility's deposit, a TSA payment, and a termination charge all cover the same forecast shortfall, regulators need to credit them against one another. Financial security works only when the ledger identifies the risk each instrument covers and prevents both a public shortfall and a duplicate private bill. Transmission is paid for differently from the energy moving across it. The electricity consumed by a data center may come from a competitive supplier. ComEd owns and operates delivery infrastructure in its Illinois territory. PJM coordinates the regional high-voltage system and wholesale market. A customer bill can therefore combine energy, distribution, and transmission obligations that answer different questions. The energy charge pays for megawatt hours. Distribution pays for the local system that brings electricity to the site. Transmission pays for the high-voltage network that moves bulk power and keeps many paths available when equipment fails. Those categories also divide regulatory authority. Illinois can decide the conditions for ComEd's retail delivery service and the deposits attached to local extensions. FERC oversees the interstate transmission rate. PJM applies the regional tariff and coordinates the studies that affect its network. One data center connection can therefore require a state tariff, a federal rate schedule, and a regional planning decision at the same time. That division limits which regulator can order a different payment method. The Illinois Attorney General and other parties argued for stronger customer assignment of construction costs. ComEd responded that Illinois could not rewrite a FERC-approved transmission allocation through a retail tariff. The ICC could require the customer to sign a TSA as a condition of retail service, but FERC would review the agreement that affects transmission revenue. This produces a handoff that viewers rarely see. The state decides that financial security is required. The negotiated agreement defines the federal transmission contribution. PJM's rate then determines how the contribution fits into the shared system. That network has fixed costs. The utility earns an approved transmission revenue requirement that includes expenses and a return on invested capital. Customers contribute through formula rates. If one anticipated large contributor is missing, the total requirement does not simply vanish. In the ComEd zone, a customer's share is influenced by its demand during the system's 5 peak hours in the prior year. That creates a special risk during a ramp. A large project can require infrastructure sized for its future load before it has established the peak usage that would produce a matching contribution. The physical cost arrives first. The ordinary rate contribution follows later. The TSA overlays a minimum contribution on that sequence. It does not wait for the campus to set 5 large peaks before assigning revenue. It uses the ramp the customer submitted when asking the utility to prepare. That is why the agreement is described as revenue security rather than an energy purchase or a simple connection deposit. This is why ComEd focused on revenue. Its position was that a shared network cannot be divided cleanly into one customer's private line and everyone else's public line. A project can trigger an upgrade, but the completed asset may serve the integrated system. Existing customers can benefit from a stronger path. Later customers may connect through it. Opponents in the Illinois case wanted a tighter link between the customer and the facilities its request caused. Some supported a contribution in aid of construction, which would assign more of the initial capital cost to the triggering project. ComEd argued that this would collide with federal transmission cost allocation and could make the first customer pay for equipment used by others. The State Commission did not pretend that this argument had become simple. It approved the deposits and TSA as consumer protections. It also left broader cost causation questions for future proceedings. That distinction matters. Approved means the Commission found the tariff and required agreement acceptable under the law before it. It does not mean every possible future bill has already been traced to the customer that caused it. The same boundary appeared at FERC. Monarch and ComEd negotiated their agreement as sophisticated parties. FERC accepted it under a legal framework known as Mobile Sierra. Commissioner Chang stressed that the Commission did not independently reconstruct every term and decide on the merits that it produced perfect consumer protection. Her concurrence called the agreement better than having no commitment. The customer now makes a meaningful transmission contribution that would not otherwise exist, but she would not equate that improvement with proof that no unjust cost shift remains. The reason becomes visible when the two clocks are placed beside each other. The TSA follows a customer's promised ramp for about a decade. A steel transmission structure can stand for several decades. Breakers, transformers, and control systems are replaced on their own schedules, but the large capital assets can remain in the transmission revenue requirement for roughly 40 years. Commissioner Chang's warning was direct. Agreements of this type may create obligations for 8 to 10 years while customers bear depreciation, financing returns, and tax allowances over the asset's useful life. That does not prove the uncovered years become a loss. By year 10, the campus may be operating at full load and paying ordinary transmission charges. Other customers may be using the upgraded network. The equipment may have avoided a different project that would otherwise have been needed. But none of those outcomes is guaranteed merely by signing the TSA. Consider 3 paths. In the first, the Rockford campus opens on schedule, reaches 600 megawatts and stays. Its payments grow with the ramp, then continue through ordinary service after the guarantee ends. The agreement works as a bridge across the risky startup years. In the second, the campus opens late. The TSA requires contributions before full usage catches up. That protects other customers from the near-term revenue gap, then the operating facility takes over. In the third, the project is cancelled. The developer pays under the agreement or a termination fee. The amount can be substantial, but the utility may still own facilities whose cost recovery lasts much longer than the contract. Whether the payment fully matches those whole life costs depends on the agreement, the assets actually built, later network use, and future rates. The public cannot answer that question from a single redacted contract total. It needs a ledger that connects the request, each upgrade, its cost, the customer's payments, and the remaining revenue requirement. That ledger should also show timing. A project can trigger engineering expenses in year 1, equipment orders in year 2, and service in year 4. Customer payments may rise on a different schedule. Even if the total contribution looks adequate over a decade, other customers may carry costs during the years before the ramp catches up. A guarantee can close that timing gap only if its payment schedule follows the utility's exposure. Cancellation creates the reverse problem. The agreement may deliver a large payment at one moment while the asset continues to earn revenue over many years. Regulators need to show where that payment is credited and how it changes later bills. Without that trail, the developer paid and customers were protected remain assertions rather than an auditable result. That is the transparency problem. If a line is described only as a general network upgrade, customers cannot tell which load triggered it. If the agreement is treated only as a private commercial document, regulators may not see whether its payment floor matches the system exposure. If the project changes names or end users, the physical need can remain while public understanding resets to zero. FERC's June 2026 action moves toward that ledger. The Commission ordered all 6 regional grid operators under its authority to justify or reform their large load rules. Among the required subjects are study processes, cost shifting, public transmission cost information, co-location, flexible service, and generation near large loads. Commissioner Rosner described cost recovery agreements in plain terms. If infrastructure is built for a data center and that data center does not show up, residential customers should not be left with the cost. That is the goal. The hard part is writing a rule that can prove it. A grid connection queue can look like a list of future demand. It is not. Developers shop for land, power, and construction schedules across multiple utilities. A single business plan can appear in more than one study process while the owner compares locations. Some requests are firm, others are options. FERC warned that this behavior can double count expected load, clog studies, and inflate forecasts. A regional operator may prepare for demand that cannot physically appear in every requested location at once. The consequence is not confined to paperwork. A higher forecast can support the case for new transmission. It can influence generation planning and the amount of capacity procured for future years. It can change which project is told that existing equipment is full. Even when a speculative request eventually leaves the queue, it may have consumed months of engineering attention. Financial security is one filter. Site control is another. As a project moves through the process, the developer can be required to show more land rights, more money, and more commitment. The cost of remaining in the queue rises as the utility's exposure rises. That approach is not designed to block every uncertain project. Major construction always contains uncertainty. It is designed to distinguish an investable plan from a free option on scarce grid capacity. The Rockford project makes this national argument tangible. The official record names a place, a ramp, and a customer. It also shows why the end user's identity is not the central engineering fact. ComEd has to study the load, whether the future tenant is a famous technology company or an undisclosed operator. The system cares about megawatts, timing, voltage, reliability behavior, and the probability that the load will arrive. The public cares about those things too, plus land, taxes, water, local construction, and the bill if the forecast is wrong. Those interests overlap, but they are not identical. The developer wants speed and certainty. ComEd wants credible information and enough financial security to build. Existing customers want a stronger grid without inheriting a private project's abandoned cost. Later applicants want the first request to be real because it may occupy the capacity they need. A well-designed agreement can align much of that. It cannot substitute for accurate geography, engineering, and public cost records. So, who pays if the Rockford data center does not arrive? The first answer is the developer. Engineering deposits cover work already performed. Facilities deposits can protect specific distribution investment. The transmission security agreement requires contributions tied to the promised load ramp even if the project is delayed or canceled, or a termination charge applies. That is stronger than a queue built on promises with no price. The second answer is still conditional. Transmission is a shared system. Its assets can remain in rates long after a startup guarantee ends. A negotiated revenue floor does not by itself prove that every dollar, over every year, follows the project that triggered it. The minimum safeguard is therefore not one contract clause. It is a complete chain of evidence, a credible site, a realistic ramp, deposits that scale with work, a revenue guarantee that survives delay or cancellation, and public reporting that connects each major upgrade to its cause and remaining cost. The field in Rockford may become a large data center campus. It may change. The grid cannot wait until opening day to find out. That is why the contract exists before the load, and it is why the contract must be judged against the physical system it asks everyone else to build.